Alright, hello and welcome. This is CT5, and today we're going to start off. With a quick game. I'm just going to pull out some games. I'm going to sort them into one of two categories. I want you to try and follow along and figure out what goes where. So, okay. Let's look at Valkyrie Chronicles. Fun game. It's going to go this side. How about XCOM? This is a game, I don't know too much about it, but I've seen some folks play it, but I know enough that it goes on this side. What about Final Fantasy Tactics? I really like this game. I know a lot about this game. I know too much about this game? I know a lot about this game. And I know that it goes on this side. What about Wildermyth? Fun game I've been playing recently. Where do you think this goes? I think I know where it goes. I think it goes here. Okay, so far so good. What about Fellseal? Have any of y'all heard of this game? This is a pretty neat indie game. And it goes over here. Who'd have thought? What about Fire Emblem? This is another game I know very little about. I literally have not played a single Fire Emblem. I know some things about it. Like the permadeath in the olden days and how that's not as big of a thing anymore and how they really care about character, like, relationship development dynamics, sort of, maybe? See, I don't know what I'm talking about. Fire Emblem people, feel free to slap me around. Okay, next game, Divinity Original Sin 2. I know this game. I don't know this game. I've played a lot of this game. Played enough of this game to know that it goes over here. And one last game, Triangle Strategy. I think you know where it goes. It's not just cause I don't have any room on this side anymore. There's more to it than that. There's more to it than that. If you'll notice a trend, these are all sort of these turn-based strategy RPG games that I love so much. Divinity Original Sin not so much, but the combat, yes, and that's why it's here. And they broadly fall under one of two sort of systems, either a sort of round-based turn system, or what I'm calling an ongoing turn system. The main comparison here is the measurement of time. So for the round-based turns, the measurement is the rounds. That's how we sort of categorize time by, and that the rounds determine how often and when people get turns. In comparison, the ongoing turns, time keeps ticking in the background, just like in real life, right? Time keeps going. And so the frequency and order of turns is determined, it's based on how fast they are, their speed, relative to the ongoing timer that runs in the background of the game. So I'm going to ramble a bit today, just sort of comparing these two different systems and sort of talking about the implications it has on the design, and sort of noticing how these different games sort of tackle the different problems and handle these various challenges that come up as a result. So that's the plan. That sounds fun. Buckle up, because who the hell knows where I'm going? I do have a plan, but you know, I'm a funny guy, so might make some detours. Alright, so we're going to first focus on the games on the left here, which I'm calling, these ongoing turns. And as you probably remember, I just said that in these games, the characters have a speed statistic. Now, you might already kind of know where I'm getting at. The sort of problem with the speed statistic is that it's oftentimes the best one to increase, or like the most important one to increase when and where you can, generally. Because the higher your speed statistic, the more quickly you get turns. The more turns you get, the more fun you have, because you get to do stuff, and doing stuff equals good and fun and good. And the problem is that it's kind of this like snowball. It's both a sort of snowball effect that makes it really hard for the the other team to handle especially once the team with the faster units get ahead. And I think more importantly, so that first complaint isn't that big a deal because these are single player games, and since it's a sort of non-competitive thing, in a single player game, it's non-competitive. Doesn't really matter. People can have fun and go nuts. That's part of the point of these games. That said, the other problem is because speed is so good to upgrade and improve, it's kind of a brain dead choice, right? It's basically almost always good to improve a unit's speed. And that's the real issue, is that it's not very... Right, it feels like you have all these options, but really there's like one clear best option. Like, why would you not do it? Again, there are obviously various things to consider, but it's like, in general, more speed, good. And that said, the sort of snowball effect does have a little bit of an effect on the overall game balance too, even if it's a single player game, because if speed gets out of control and you just have so many turns and you can sort of do whatever you want, then like it kind of defeats the challenge of the game, and that's another part of these games, right? For the people who want to play it with a challenge, obviously they can find another way to do it, but then it's a tricky balance to manage. Sort of like player expectations, what people want, what players get out of playing the game, as well as from the designer developer side, making the game interesting for the player. And that's where the sort of round-based system comes in. It sort of emerged and developed in parallel. But I think before I get that, I think I want to talk a little... let's talk about the round-based, the turns using the games using these round-based turns, and then we'll dive back into a little bit more into nitty-gritty of the games we see on the left there. So what's cool about these games here, using this round-based turn system, you sort of you can just toss aside this problem of the speed statistic on characters in the game. Suddenly it's a lot more controlled and a lot more fair, right? Like, within a round, every character gets one turn. They can still do a lot of cool stuff in that one turn, but you don't have this sort of runaway snowball effect I mentioned in the other games. From the list here, Valkyria Chronicles is sort of an exception because of the way... So the way the turn system works in Valkyria Chronicles is, in a given round, you have X amount of command points, CP, as they call it. And on your turn, when it's a player's turn to choose who to move around and whatnot, you spend these command points to activate a unit. You can activate the same unit multiple times in Valkyria Chronicles. And that's why it's not exactly the same. There are penalties for activating the same unit multiple times, but that option does make it a bit of an outlier as compared to the rest. I think Wildermyth is like by far the most traditional and simplest version of these, of what's here anyways. Disgaea, that series is another really, really good example of these round-based turns, where you just sort of have all your units do all their stuff at once, and then the enemies all do their stuff at once. So on the player side, a couple things emerge. So one, right, as a designer, you don't have to worry about the speed statistic, as I mentioned. But the weirder thing now is that because potentially so many things are happening all at once, as a player, you don't have a chance to respond to the enemy stuff until after all the enemies have taken their turn, which does have the potential to be like very devastating and completely blowouty and stuff, right? Like if you're caught unawares, if you're out of position and suddenly an enemy sneaks in that you didn't know that came out of nowhere and wrecks your shit, like it can be really bad. So these games can potentially have this sort of swingier element. And so something that comes up that I know for sure is in Valkyria Chronicles, XCOM, and Wildermyth, they have cover systems, i.e. so designers put these defensive mechanisms in place to encourage you to sort of position and use these defensive mechanisms to mitigate the potential onslaught of bad stuff that the game can throw at you. And that's complete. And those sort of like cover mechanics are completely, like more or less like not anywhere in the games on the left side there, right? On the left side, it's very much just about placing your units. Arguably, you can say, okay, the cover encouraged you to place your units, around cover, right? You're still like right. This genre of games as a whole wants you to be very careful and to really think about where you place and move your units to. They just do it in different ways, and I feel like the cover system is a direct consequence of the fact that in these round-based turn games, on the right-hand side, the enemy can just do so many things to you. So as a result, because another consequence of the fact that the enemies can do so many things to you all at once, is that the games on the right sort of face, the designers and developers face a different challenge here. Again, depending on your perspective and whatnot, but like a sort of optimal play pattern is to sort of very methodically just wipe out the enemies you can see and then just slowly move forward. It's a play pattern that makes a lot of sense, right? Because if you deal with all the problems, then they can't hurt you, etc., etc. And the less enemies there are, the less bad things that can happen to you. That's good. If there's less things, it's easier for you to manage the onslaught of stuff, right? If it's just like a ripple versus a tidal wave of stuff coming at you, one of those is easier to deal with than the other. It's a tricky little balance. And so because there is the potential for people to play at a sort of slow pace, to encourage action, so like XCOM sort of does this the best in one sense. So in XCOM, if I remember correctly, how many turns you take in the actual combat does have consequences to the rest of the game. So XCOM, like Wildermyth, there's a sort of in-battle component to the game as well as an overworld part of the game. And the overworld part of the game, you're sort of managing all these little different things, all these things going on. And in XCOM, how long you take in battle does affect the consoles outside, because things are still happening, right? So if you take too long in the battle, sure, you did great, no one was hurt, but suddenly you go back to your base and there's problems everywhere else. So it's cool in that this is a very active design choice by the designers. There's this sort of ongoing, constant feeling of tension for the player in that they have to figure out the best way to sort of balance, how quickly they take it while managing risk. Whereas Wildermyth, that is not the case. You can take however long you want in battle. It does not affect the overworld portion of the game at all. That's another little interesting tidbit that the designers have to keep in mind making these types of games. Now here's an interesting thing. Divinity Original Sin 2, it's the only one game in that sort of series franchise I've played, does things differently. So to combat the sort of all at once, from the players, then all at once from the enemies, that kind of sort of huge swinginess feel, in Divinity Original Sin 2, what happens here is enemies and players take turns. Essentially, in Divinity, if there are more enemies than there are player units, then eventually the enemies get a string of turns at once. So it's round-based, right? Every unit gets one turn within the round, but then it's like highest initiative on one team goes first. So say the player has the highest initiative unit of all the units, that unit goes first, then the highest initiative unit from the enemy team goes, and then back to a player, enemy, etc., until the round ends, until everyone's taken their action and the round ends. What's cool here is that this is it makes the back and forth feeling like very immediate and palpable. It's right there. It's in your face. It's happening. The feeling of tension in Divinity is different than the feeling of tension in Valkyrie Chronicles, XCOM, Wildermyth, etc. So in those latter three games, I feel like the tension is sort of based on what can happen on the opponent's. Okay, that sounds very general and applies to both. What's a better way to say it? I can do this. For Valkyria, XCOM, Wildermyth, it's more of a, is my plan gonna go well? Whereas Divinity, it's a bit more frantic. It's more action, like in your face action pack, and that it's just happening like right now. Or there's less of a waiting. because you go and then the enemy immediately has some sort of response to what you did, but then you have a response, etc., etc. It really drives the tension and excitement a bit more so having that immediate back and forth, in my opinion. Like, especially in like Wildermyth, for example, where there's no time pressure for how long you take in your battle. In Wildermyth, it's kind of relaxed. It's very methodical. I think is the best way to put it. It's very methodical. Just slow down, pick him off, just do your thing really calmly. Don't worry about it too much. XCOM, you kind of have to go to make the rest of the games a little bit more manageable. And Divinity, it's just in your face. Stuff happening all the time. And the thing with Divinity is like part of the game is that each turn is very dynamic and big. Like the potential for stuff to happen is like surprisingly huge, and part of the game is how interactable everything is. So what really stands out is like how mobile and how dynamic and how much things can move in Divinity. You have a lot of the sort of notorious spell in Divinity is teleport. You teleport an object or a person from one location to somewhere else. But in addition to that, there's like 3 or 4 at least different abilities that let a player move from one location to another in a sort of teleporty way, such that they can sort of ignore, terrain and height differences and whatever else to an extent. And because people are going all over the place and that it's strange. It's actually strange how much can happen in a turn in Divinity, sort of compared to some of the other games, sort of. I mean, Final Fantasy Tactics, CT5 Holy, whatever else, blah, 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 right? But it was something that stuck in my mind, how mobile and dynamic the turns in the battles are. Because in a lot of these other games, you can't really, like, make these sort of huge movements where you're moving, like, across the map. Okay, so Divinity having this sort of back and forth turn system is, we can think of it as I don't know if a response is the right word, but it sort of addresses a potential play pattern. This in Divinity, you're going to have a very different play pattern than the play pattern of Wildermyth or XCOM, for example. So fun enough, triangle strategy, we're sort of shifting back into ongoing turn stuff. But like, what's interesting is that, while these two systems, the games under these two systems have their own unique problems, some problems are still similar, and it's an example of convergent evolution, as it were. I guess I should point out right now that these different turn-based systems, while they're very important, I don't think they're like the most, I don't necessarily think they're like the defining system in these games. It will, the type of turn system you go with will heavily affect a lot of your decisions down the line, but it's not like the most important one. But it's important. It's worth considering, and obviously the designers, they've thought about it too. Okay, so what I was saying, back and forth from Divinity Original Sin, back and forth in triangle strategy, and how it worked here is in triangle strategy, there's a speed statistic. Talk a little bit more about that, the details. So, faster units get their turns more often than not. What's different here is that every unit at the start of a fight has a sort of hidden initiative score that determines the starting turn order. It determines where they are in the starting turn order. That's slightly modifiable by speed. And then once that initial starting turn order is set, and once the battle actually starts, then each unit's individual speed statistic affects how frequently they'll get their future turns from there. So what's cool is that a lot of the units in general in this game have the same speed, especially enemy units, because they don't get fancy pieces of equipment that the players do. So a lot of the enemies hover around the same speed. But because of this sort of staggered offset initiative system, even though units have the same speed, a lot of the units have the same speed, these units will be moving at different spots in the relative turn order. which is interesting because in Final Fantasy Tactics, for example, that speed system is a lot simpler. It's just basically all the units of the same speed, generally speaking, will get their turn at the same time. They all go, and then we move on to the next lowest or the next highest speed, etc., etc., etc. So I mentioned Final Fantasy Tactics here because, as a consequence of that, right, we sort of have this all units of the same speed type moving at once, and then the next units of the next speed moving, etc., etc. A common play pattern you end up seeing is all the units move, and then like the slowest unit, all the other enemies have moved already, the slowest unit gets to go, and then everyone's nice and clumped up and can deliver a huge AoE spell. Sometimes it's the player doing it, sometimes it's the enemy doing it, and it really hurts. And so Triangle Strategy actually offsets that. You can't you can't as easily take advantage of like enemy AI like clumping up for various reasons. So what's cool about Triangle Strategy having the sort of staggered unit initiative and having units of the same speed moving, getting their turns at different times and at different relative parts in the turn order, is that as a player, you can't really wait for a safe spot. You can't really wait for a safe time necessarily to attack a unit, because if you move a unit to attack one, like soon enough, a similar unit in that nearby same position and same speed will get their turn and can move and smack your unit as well. So it very sneakily forces you to think about and consider the turn order as you play the game, which I think is really neat. I think this made me think about my movements more, definitely in a different way than other games, and that's part just because different games are different. But like I couldn't rely on the play pattern I was using, right? Like the sort of wildermythy play pattern of, because you can sort of apply that same play pattern of methodically picking off units in a sort of safe and efficient manner, and it doesn't translate as smoothly to Triangle Strategy. It's still doable, and eventually you develop ways to do it, but you have to do it a little bit differently than what at least what I initially thought I had to, and the way I moved. Right, and as a result of like, if you try to attack an enemy unit in that game, like pretty soon another enemy unit will have their back and be able to smack you. And because of the follow-up system, the follow-up attack system in Triangle Strategy, that makes it extra punishing if you don't move, if you don't consider the enemy turn order as you make an attack. It is extra punishing in Triangle Strategy. Thought that was pretty cool. So I guess another thing I should mention is that, like, I think Final Fantasy Tactics in general obviously set a huge precedent in terms of like overall game quality and experience and fun and story that a lot of other games don't quite live up to. It's hard to argue with that. But for game designers, there's a ton to learn about from Final Fantasy Tactics as well. So again, Tactics Ogre also came out around the same time as Final Fantasy Tactics. I don't know which one was first or not, but Tactics Ogre is also in this ongoing turn camp. So it also had a speed statistic and suffers a lot of the same problem, has the same design challenges that we've been talking about. And right, the round-based turn system came about as an alternative, as a sort of simpler design alternative. Right, you don't have the design challenge of the potentially very messy speed statistic. But there are other things that I think a lot of these games learn from Final Fantasy Tactics. So a couple weird things about Final Fantasy Tactics. One, I think this is the only game that I know of where the measurement of time is actually kind of visible. Right, so these ongoing turns, it's based on a sort of ongoing measurement of time that's ticking in the background of the game that we as players don't see. Right, as players, we just see when a unit gets their turn. But there's obviously some sort of mechanism going on in the background to determine that turn order, right? So in Final Fantasy Tactics, we actually can see it, and it's in the CT bar. The CT bar is it's a measurement of like how close a particular unit is to getting their turn, we can actually measure the frequency of a unit getting their turn. In these other games, it's all hidden. It's all hidden. It's a lot hard to quantify the impact of speed in these other games. You can feel it. If there's enough of a difference, you can feel it. So that's another thing. In Final Fantasy Tactics, the characters, as they level up, they get more speed. Triangle strategy, none of that. None of that. Triangle strategy, all units, they have their base speed. There are a few ways to increase their speed based on like equipment and the upgrade features in the game, but levels do not increase speed, and that's a very direct consequence, I think, from learning from the past. The other whack thing about Final Fantasy Tactics, like, there's multiple, but I think what they were doing with charge time was essentially like uncharted territory that you don't see a lot of games do now. An interesting dilemma happened in Final Fantasy Tactics, which is that the later game spells had longer charge times. However, if it's later in the game, units were higher level, had a higher speed, able to get their turns more quickly, possibly even before that super awesome spell you've been wanting to learn and use for so long can actually go off. Huge, huge awkward moment. It was an unfortunate consequences that the designers didn't realize, but at the same time, like, what they're going on, makes sense, right? A more powerful, impressive spell, takes more time to cast, costs more MP. Like, it makes sense. It's just sort of unfortunate. But that's what FFT mods are for. If you want to, yeah. The last super whack thing that other games 100% learn from is status duration. In basically almost all these games, all of them. I don't know about Fire Emblem, don't quote me there. But in so many of these, in basically all of them, the duration of status effects, buffs and debuffs, is based on the unit turn. So it's like for 2 turns or for 3 turns, this unit has suffered this condition, buff or debuff, whatever, right? In Final Fantasy Tactics, this was based on that sort of hidden timer, the hidden measurement of time that keeps going on. And I don't think the game tells you how long the statuses last either. So there's another weird thing where at the beginning of the game, when units had low speed, statuses kind of sucked. They last like one enemy turn maybe, and that was it. 2 if you're lucky. But late game, when units are super fast, you can disable a unit for like 4 turns. It's wacky. It's wacky and weird, and my god, what a simpler way to just tie it to unit turns, and again, dodge all that speed nonsense. Like, a triangle strategy heavily minimized how impactful speed would be. Right? Both the turn status thing, right? The time statuses, status duration to unit turns, not having speed increase on level up, and having speed increases be fairly limited, and or having a big cost as well, in that the most common way to increase your speed is through equipment, but you only have 2 equipment slots, so it's like it feels like a much bigger sacrifice. Whereas again, fucking Final Fantasy Tactics, you could have like, I don't know, fucking like at least 3 pieces of gear that increase your speed as well, and like it gets messy. It can get really messy from like a sort of like balance perspective, right? Good thing these are all single player games. But the last thing to note is the reward for waiting and not doing anything. Think about when you would want to do nothing. You're playing a fucking video game. That's like not the point of a video game, except for these games. And it's a lot weirder to want to wait and sort of do nothing. So what's cool is that in these sort of ongoing turn systems like Final Fantasy Tactics, Triangle Strategy, etc., it feels better to wait, because in the round-based turn system, like the games on the right, if you only have 1 turn per round and you choose to spend it doing nothing, that hurts so much relatively, right? It still feels that way for the games on the left, but it's not like because it doesn't have that structure, it doesn't sort of intuitively feel as bad, and they have ways to reward you in that they find ways to make your next turn come up sooner. So in Final Fantasy Tactics, if you move and act on your turn, you sort of start from 0. If you move or act, if you do one of move or act, you start from 20. If you full wait, do not move, do not act, full wait, you start from 40. So your turn comes back 40% faster. That's one way to think about it. Triangle Strategy halves that bonus, funnily enough. A full wait is you start from your turn comes back 20% faster. If you do one move or act, it's 10% faster. Next turn comes back 10% faster. Divinity actually has, as far as I can tell, has the closest to waiting, in that in Divinity you have the option to delay your turn. And there's several interesting things going on in Divinity. But so delaying your turn in Divinity, what it does is it shifts your turn from wherever you are to the end of the turn order. So you still get your turn in the round, you don't sort of lose anything, but obviously you're just choosing not to do anything now. Obviously if you delay, the benefit is that you think it's more worth it to do something later rather than right now. So that's actually something interesting. I don't think a lot of these other games, if you choose to wait, it's just purely for positional advantage, for like positional reasoning, to not do anything with a given unit in the other round-based turn games. Whereas ongoing turn-based games, the waiting can be to preserve positioning, but I think more often it's to find a better timing, kind of like delaying your turn in Divinity Original Sin 2. Another note about triangle strategy is that in triangle strategy, the speed, the sort of effects of speed are minimized by design, and it also feels minimized simply because there's so many units on the field, right? It just doesn't feel as noticeable to have a faster character. If you have 10 units on your side, and then you have one person who's faster, such that every now and then you get 11 turns to the enemy 10, doesn't feel that's that big of a deal, right? It's 10% more turns. But it's sort of a funny consequence about the sort of staggered units that goes on in triangle strategy, in that, like, if an enemy moves and then it's your super speedy unit's turn, they go in and smack, but they're fast enough such that they can retreat or attack again or whatever else before the unit they first hit can do something about it. Kind of a big deal, right? Because suddenly, so we mentioned, right, enemy moves, you move into smack, second enemy unit runs in and smacks your person. Usually, eventually, right, the person you attack will also get their turn and smack your person around. But if you can only take one hit instead of two, like, it's weird how it doesn't feel that big of a deal, but when it is, it matters. And like later on, when speed differences are a little bit more pronounced, like through a combination of better equipment and the upgrades, actually being able to know that you can sort of safely run in and attack someone because you know that you'll be able to go quickly enough to get out of there safely is like huge relief. Huge relief. It's just so interesting seeing how these all deal with different things. Very interesting. I like these games. All right, a little bit rambly, but still a lot of fun. Hope it's informative for y'all to sort of notice how all these mechanics are connected and how they affect each other. Maybe y'all can think of stuff yourself. For those of you who have played Fire Emblem, please tell me why it's worth playing, because I haven't yet. Who knows if I ever will, but would be curious to hear about it. That's all I've got for today. As always, thank you very much for humoring me and listening to me ramble about some of my favorite things. And I will see y'all next time.